Welcome everybody, I'm the Constant Way, and this is the third video in our Judgement Eternal Champions Hero Breakdown by class. Today, we're looking at our biggest chunk of heroes, Assassins and Bruisers. As before, you see all the 33 heroes available at launch on the right, grouped by what I would consider their primary class. Now, Judgement classes don't provide any innate abilities, and there's no requirement to take heroes of each class, but you'll find that bringing heroes from various classes tends to give you a diverse toolbox to work with on the tabletop. This video series is meant to help you go just a little bit deeper, highlighting the unique contributions each hero brings to the table, and justifying why you'd want to pick one over the other from the same class, rather than just picking all the champions of your god. Assassins and Bruisers represent your melee damage dealers, or you might hear older players refer to them as aggressors. They help you win by killing heroes, monsters, and potentially even your opponent's effigy itself. Now you can see this is the largest pool of heroes we've discussed, with 3 primary assassins and 6 primary bruisers in total. In my list here, the top 3 are your assassins, the next 3 are your high damage bruisers, and the last 3 are your more utility style bruisers that bring a few more tricks up their sleeve beyond just the raw damage that they do. Your damage dealers are often defined by god choice, but there's actually a fair amount of variety depending on the god you choose. You can see if you're playing Bruellen, you're elbows deep in options, whereas if you're playing Ista, you only have 2, and none of them are champions of Torrent, which means you should pick the melee damage dealer that best synergizes with the other heroes that you're bringing. Should be no surprise that if you can't kill your opponent, you're probably going to have a bad time. So you commonly take more than one melee damage dealer in your warband. However, you need to carefully consider who gets priority for levels, fate, and items, as some of these heroes become significantly more powerful as you invest in them. Be careful about bringing multiple heroes who want, say, the Vorpal Blade, or Fate every turn, or an early level 2. Now I'll talk about each of these heroes via a few lenses. First off, burst damage. Can they spike the damage during their activation, or are they more chip 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 consistent damage over time, which is reliability. Damage floor might be another term for it, but essentially, if you send them in, are they going to give you at least a certain amount of output, or could dice completely bone you and you got nothing in the end? Survivability, of course, all of these heroes benefit from killing or do their job by killing your opponent for you, and so they'll often end up collecting souls. It doesn't do you any good if they collect a soul and then get counter killed and you immediately lose that soul that you just gained. Fourth up, jungling. The monsters that spawn in Judgement can actually be incredibly powerful and impactful on the game, so it's important to have a hero in your warband that can quickly deal with them. In this case, it's by killing them and collecting the bounty and the level, which is great. So I'll mention a bit about the jungling aspect if you're familiar with the MOBA style terminology that I'm using there. Fifth, we'll talk about their utility. Do they bring anything to the table other than just raw damage? And finally, how do they fit in with their other various god options? Why might you take, say, Rakkir over Fazeal in Tomas, or Drelgoth over Brok in Bruellen? So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Let's start out with Fazeal. Looking at his stats, you can see they're fairly standard on paper. He does have an extraordinarily high soul harvest of 4, but that's because he's undead, so he's not actually soul harvesting, he's soul consuming. Go ahead and look at the undead rules in the core rulebook for details on that, but essentially it means he gets to eat souls and either heal himself or damage nearby enemies when he does so. Looking at his move, it's 3, Agi 4, Res 0, Mel 7, very boring. His Blightbringer sword is a 2-3-5, very standard damage grid. But we start getting into his common innate abilities, so you can see his dash abilities. He is, in fact, on a horse. So whenever he makes an advance once per activation, he gets to add +1 movement to one of those advances, which extends that all-important charge threat range just a bit further. He also is mounted, so that when he does charge, getting that +1 mail and +1 damage on the charge, that extended charge that he does makes him a little bit above average in that regard. And of course, like we mentioned, he is undead, so that when he kills somebody, their soul goes to the nearest non-undead model that's eligible, friendly hero model. And when he gets killed, his soul automatically gets banked to the opponent's effigy, which means if you overextend with him and he gets killed, there's no way you're getting that soul back. So be careful about that. Now, talking about his burst, He absolutely has burst. You look over at his combat maneuvers, at decapitation. Now it's 2J and 1F to pull off, so it's actually pretty tough to pull off normally just by rolling dice, but it doubles the amount of damage that the enemy just took. Now remember, because he's mounted, +1 damage on the attack. So let's say he charges in, he rolls that crit. Normally it's a 5. Because of mounted, it goes up to 6. If you roll the decapitation, suddenly that's 12 damage. That's a lot of burst. But looking at the math, 2J is actually really hard to pull off. I think it gets to be about 50% when you hit somewhere around 10 attack dice, which is doable, but not common. So what really you're going to be seeing decapitation get used for is on the Tomas effigy power turn, where the cost of maneuvers go down to 1s, or the base maneuver cost of maneuvers go down to 1s rather than this 2j. You still have to spend the fate, but it's a lot easier to land that 1s crit than it is to try and do the 2j. Otherwise, you better hope you've got like knockdown in your warband and other ways to give him lots and lots of dice. In terms of reliability, he's decently reliable for damage because he can charge and he gets a lot of dice to do that. Obviously, he's also the avatar of Tomas, so that means he gets, as the avatar bonus, +1 melee and +1 movement on the charge. He gets even faster and even more threatening on the charge, so you get even more reliable charge attacks. But outside of that, when he's not charging, pretty mediocre as far as the damage dealer goes, so keep that in mind. However, his survivability is definitely where he steps it up a notch. So, Agi 4, decent stats. 15 health, not too bad. Just gets 1 health at level 2 and 2 health at level 3. But you start looking at his other abilities. So, looking at his combat maneuver, Affliction, he can poison an enemy. Poison, of course, provides -1 to their offensive stat, be it L, range, or magic. So if they're going to try and counterattack him after he poisons them, they're a little worse off. You look over at his active ability Pestilence, which does a bit of damage, D3 true damage, and then also inflicts another -1 penalty to Male, Mage, RNG, Agi, and Soul Harvest, just like poison, and it in fact stacks. So now they're at -2 to potentially attack him back, and makes him a lot tankier. Then you look at his level 2 Bloodthirst, where his Leech ability that he gets Leech 1 as because he's an undead can temporarily raise his base health by up to 5 hit points. So rather than just being that base, say, 16 health at level 2, he can overheal with this Bloodthirst ability and end up sitting comfortably on 21 hit points at Agi 4. Additionally, you're taking him in Tomas, which means he's eligible, or you're often taking him Tomas, I should say, which means he's eligible to take the Diamond Armor, which gives him +1 res and immunity to 1 point of Armor Shredder. Pair that with some of these heroes, these tanky heroes we call out in the synergies, like say Marcus, who can provide him Protective Stance. Suddenly, it's Agi 4, res 2, ignores 1 Armor Shredder, and has a Leech and an Overheal ability with the ability to debuff other opponents' offensive stats in his Affliction Poison and his Pestilence. The dude can survive. Now, you look over at his level 3 finally, see it's this Tendrils of Death. It's this AoE ability where D3 +1 enemies within 3 axes of Fazeal take 2 true damage and then he heals that amount equal to the amount he damaged. So on average, let's say you do D2 or 2 on the D3 +1, 3, you deal out 6 damage distributed across 3 enemy heroes, and he heals for 6. So he's actually quite tanky as long as you don't really overextend and get him killed and lose that soul to banked in the opponent's effigy. His jungling, not so great. Again, decapitation's really kind of unreliable, and if you have to spend a fate to deal a bunch of burst damage to try and kill that monster, kind of missing out on collecting, benefiting from the fate for the bounty. So, okay, not great. Utility is what we called out before. It's mostly via that Affliction and that Pestilence that he's doing, debuffing enemies and helping out, say, Rakkir, who also likes it when people poison. When you look at options within God. Of course, he's the avatar of Tomas, so it's really difficult to argue against including him by default in Tomas. Got a great toolkit and is just a generally great aggressor. If you start looking at him out of God, consider those extra synergies and make sure that you're bringing heroes that would include or that would benefit from the, say, poison or curse or other debuffs that he inflicts. So specifically speaking about synergies, obviously Rakkir for the poison. Nias with her AoE poison ability gives him additional targets to hit with Pestilence. So Nias goes in, she hits an enemy with Poison Cloud that debuffs 2 enemies with poison, and then he goes in and Pestilences and gets to hit both of those poison enemies already. Awesome. You can set up some really big Pestilences in those cases. Masuzi also does curse and poison, so good synergy there. Marcus, like we mentioned, his protective stance can be really helpful for Fazeal. We call out Sky specifically as sort of a defender here for Fazeal because he's one of the few that can actually keep up with him, thanks to the dash ability that Sky has. So definitely something to keep an eye on. Additionally, Sky's level 2, where he can recall and bring somebody with him, allows you to make sure that Fazeal's soul doesn't get inexorably bound to the opponent's effigy when you inevitably overextend with him. So, all in all, good option for Fazeal. Next up on our assassin list, we've got Rakkir, the quintessential orc rogue, really here. Again, quick look at his stats. Very standard: move 3, ag 4, res 0, mel 7, 2, 3, 5 dagger damage line. His common and innate abilities don't give him a lot. Shadow just means he uses shadow orbs, which we'll get to later. However, his unique innate ability of Cloak of Darkness does give him at least another +1 agi against RNG attacks, so he's a little bit harder to shoot at, which is great. Now we move on to Burst, and that is kind of one of Rakkir's defining abilities. We jump over to his Toxin active ability for 1 fate. An adjacent enemy suffering poison takes 2d6 true damage. If you roll a 12 after, you solid somebody, just dealt 15 damage and they died in 1 attack. Pretty good. Unfortunately, if you roll, a 2, well, you just spend a fate to deal 2 extra damage. Not so great. So he's absolutely can be a bursty hero. However, he doesn't always have to be. So thinking about reliability, he's not that reliable because his Toxin ability does require, if he's just by himself, to land a 2 maneuver, that 2s Viper Strike, to poison his target, and then he can roll his 2d6 true damage, which sometimes can leave you out in the cold. So generally speaking, if you're banking on getting that Toxin damage, wouldn't actually say he's very reliable. You can do some things to mitigate that, like bringing other heroes that also poison, so that he doesn't have to worry about rolling that Viper Strike, but it is something you have to plan around a little bit. Now, where he excels actually is, I would say he's the most survivable melee damage dealer in the game. Why is that? Because you can essentially play him as a ranged damage dealer with his Shadow Step and Shadow Rift abilities, and additionally at level 2 with his Escape ability. So, because he's a Shadow Orb user, what that means is he gets to place down a Shadow Orb adjacent to him, and then he has Shadow Step or Escape, whereby he gets to teleport from an adjacent Shadow Orb to adjacent another Shadow Orb that you placed earlier on the map, or back to your effigy. So he can charge in, kill somebody with Toxin or whatever burst ability, and then bloop, teleport back to the effigy. Now, he also, you don't have to do that Toxin play. You can just always charge in, deal damage, and step back into safety. So he's almost like a gun, where you're just constantly shooting him out, pulling him back, shooting him out, pulling him back. He always gets to stay safe, and you never risk giving up his soul to an opponent, which may be a necessary way to play him, especially if you're finding yourself, say, fate strapped, and you've got other places you want to spend your fate on rather than just Rakkir's Toxin. So depending on your playstyle, he can be incredibly survivable. And if you're not banking on him landing that Toxin or that poison, and that's okay, he can provide you fairly reliable damage as he just charges in, hopefully lands a crit, and then pulls out. In terms of a jungling, no two ways about it. I think he kind of sucks. um, they're like Terra, for example, is immune to conditions, which means Terra cannot be poisoned, so you cannot toxin Terra, even if you wanted to. Um, and if you have to spend fate to kill a monster, that's kind of counterproductive to killing a monster to pick up the fate bounty anyway. And he's got no other special abilities that help him jungle better than any other melee damage dealer. So I don't really like Rakkir for jungling. I think he's better spent doing other things. His utility, really the only call out here is generally his shadow abilities. If you're bringing other heroes that benefit from shadow orbs, like Cradle or Zarin, for example, great inclusion there. When you're looking at his god options, his gods are Tomas and Krognar. He fits very naturally into both of these, and it's almost hard to find an argument not to bring him in his two gods. With Tomas, of course, the effigy bonus from Tomas letting you bring his Viper Strike down to just 1s instead of 2s makes his burst a lot more reliable. Plus, of course, he synergizes, like we just mentioned, with Zeal and other poison users. And then in Krognar, he's bringing those Shadow Orbs, which the Krognar Effigy power uses, a bunch of the Krognar champions use. So he's a very natural fit in all of his god options. Why might you take him out of God? One, if you want a very survivable melee damage dealer, like we said, you want somebody who can go in, do his damage, get out, and not risk losing a soul. He's a good option to consider. And then, of course, anytime you're bringing a bunch of poison, maybe you're doing in Tauren and don't have a bunch of fate that you want to spend on other heroes, definitely look at Rakkir as an option there. His synergies, I think we've beat that horse to death. Poison heroes and Shadow Orb heroes. His cautions, he wants fate, really wants fate. He does want levels, or sorry, items in general, because that 2S on his Mel 7 can be a little bit dicey. And if you never land that poison, never gets to toxin, and that's a bit of a bummer. Or you can lean harder into giving him more poison setup with some of those, Fazeal, Nias, Misuzi, etc. Heroes that can help mitigate that dicey weakness that he potentially has. Our third and final assassin is Zhonyja, the Orc Berserker, or I guess Orc Warrior, technically. Looking at her stats, she's move 3, Agi 4, Res 0, Mel 8, the highest base Mel stat in the game, with the standard 2-3-5 attack line on her Great Axe. You will note, however, her Berserker Rage, where she gets +1 damage on a Great Axe attack when she has 7 health or less. So certainly she can do a lot of just base damage there. And then her level 2 Relentless Charge gives her +1 move and +1 mail when resolving the charge action. So she's been competing with those mounted heroes on that threat extension, threat danger on her charge, which is pretty sweet. And then she is the avatar of Bruellen. So the avatar bonus that she benefits from when you call your effigy power is that she can reroll one of her attacks once per activation, which is really cool when we start talking about her burst and we look at that the Reaper Calls ability. So when Zhonyja lands a critical hit with her attack, place a fury counter on the model hit. They are then removed at the end of Zhonya's activation. We jump over to Death Toll. For 1 fate, enemies within 2 hexes take 1d6 true damage for each fury counter on them. Roll separately for each model. Here's her burst damage. So if she charges in normally, she lands a crit, deals 5. Swings again, hopefully you land another crit, deal another 5 for 10 total damage. They've got 2 fury tokens on them. You spend 1 fate to Death Toll, 2d6 true damage, average 7 damage on 2d6, 70 damage, they're dead. If you go a little nutty and you can stack that up even higher, so to go into the full realm of absurdity, let's look at her level 3 Counter-Strike, where it's an interrupt that when she gets charged by an enemy, she can interrupt an attack after the enemy has finished the charging but before they attack her. She can then crit, technically, land that 5 damage, add a fury token to the opponent. Let's say she survives that charge that they just did. She then has her 3 attacks that she can swing back on. Let's say she crits all 3 times. That's well, 20 damage. So unless they're a really resilient tank, they probably didn't survive. But even if they did, you now have 4 Fury tokens on the target that she can then death toll and do 46 true damage on. Uh, that's a little silly. We can get even sillier with Krul's Bloodlust and the Bruellan Effigy power turn. Krul's Bloodlust, of course, makes their an attack cost 1 less AP, and the Bruellan Effigy power turn reduces the AP cost of a charge by 1. So let's say Zhonyja has Bloodlust on her from Krul, and it's the Bruellan Effigy power turn. She charges. We've got now a -2 uh, action cost on that charge, which means she charges for absolutely free. She lands that crit, deals 5 damage. She then has 3 more actions to attack, hopefully crit, attack, attack, attack. You're getting the picture here. She can deal an absurd amount of damage. You can also combine this with the second wind sacred artifact from Bruellan, where she gets another action point if she kills an enemy during her activation. Now, this is typically something you're going to not need to make more attacks or do more damage with. Instead, it's she kills somebody and then backs up. Because she doesn't have any particularly remarkable defensive abilities or stats, distance is her best friend to keeping her safe. So definitely look at that second wind artifact to get your kill with those normal base 3 actions, and then with the bonus 4th action second wind gives you, back up. Her reliability is actually pretty good because of her mel 8. She's rolling more dice than most other damage dealers do. And again, just with that 2-3-5 base damage stat line, no complaints there when you're packing a mel 8 with that as well. Her survivability is not great. She doesn't have remarkably good health. She doesn't have remarkably good defensive stats and no real defensive abilities. So make sure that you're going to plan on keeping her safe, maybe with a nice defender, or you can also buy her boots of agility to make her agi 5 or some other defensive item that works best for you. So definitely keep an eye on that and invest in her survivability so she can keep those souls that she earns. Her jungling is okay. It's not great. She's again another fate based, burst damage dealer. So you don't really want to spend a fate to kill monsters, but she's also that mel 8. So she is more reliable in just her base damage track. So not terrible, but not ideal. Utility, she has absolutely no utility whatsoever. She exists to deal damage and nothing else. Her god options, she's always a strong contender in, as you might expect, Bruellan, since she is the avatar, does damage across any given defensive stat line. Outside of Bruellan, she's a little bit of a harder sell. Again, she is, purely just this offensive weapon, so if you just want to make sure that you have the ability to kill something, you can certainly look at Zhonyja as an option, but oftentimes there are in-god competitors that might bump her out of consideration there. So just think about the various synergies when you're building with a god that isn't Bruellan. We already called out Second Wind as a general synergy. Other than that, she doesn't really need much. That high mel 8, decent damage line, and burst ability and death toll means that she kind of does her job no matter what. So you don't have to build in a whole lot of synergies. Might consider some protection. So in the cautions, she wants that fate for death toll. You don't have to spend it, but it's certainly something that she kind of wants to, you should kind of plan on if you're going to maximize what you're getting out of Zhonyja. And then the protection so that when she does get her kills, you don't get her counter killed. Moving on to our first high damage bruiser, Brok. So Brok is a dwarf. You can notice that looking at his stats. He does have, to be fair, a remarkably high soul harvest of 3 as far as the damage dealer goes. So if you're really pressed and you've got some maybe friends nearby, soul, he can go for that soul harvest. It's probably not his plan A or maybe even plan B, but keep it in mind. His movement is 2. He is a dwarf, slow. He does have dash to make that at least movement 3 for, say, his all-important charge, so he's not completely out-threatened by just a base move 3 hero, but will have trouble repositioning, so consider carefully where you end up putting him on the map, especially if he's going off to the side to chase after a monster. which he's particularly adept at killing. We'll get to that later. He has standard Dwarf Agi 3, so a little bit lower than normal. Res 0. However, he does have Savagery as one of his active abilities, where he can spend an action to get +1 mil and +1 res, which expires at the end of his next activation. This tends to be an ability where you don't have anything better to do. Maybe it's turn 1, you just want to advance him twice and not really go anywhere else. So he'll walk, do Savagery, and be ready for turn 2 to come in swinging hard, or in whatever situation where you just find yourself bonus action. Savagery is great to pop, but not something you're going to typically use as like, okay, I'm going to Savagery and then I'm going to go attack. Because you'd be better off just attacking and then using that third action to attack again or back up. And then his mill of 7, again, very standard. Lances for 2, solids for 3, crits for 5, standard stuff. However, we get into his unique innate ability there with Backswing, where when he crits, he can immediately make another Great Axe attack for 0 actions after resolving the first attack. However, attacks generated from Backswing cannot score critical blows. And of course can only be triggered once during his activation, so he can't just keep critting and cycling backswings. What this means is that his damage ceiling with just normal attacks is crit for 5, solid for 3, for a total of 8. Which, if you consider he just swings crits and solids for all 3 actions that he gets during his activation, 8 times 3 is 24? Math isn't my strong suit, but that seems pretty good. However, when we talk about reliability, because he has to crit in order to get that backswing, maybe not the most reliable. And for that reason, you kind of want to invest items in him or give him other buffs that will increase his either melee stat or just ability to hit, like Knockdown or the Vorpal Blade or Bastion's Heroic Ballad, that sort of thing. His survivability, we already called out Savagery as the ability to give him +1 res, which means his Agi 3 isn't quite so bad. He does have Dwarf Health, which is great. Dwarves have a little bit higher than normal health, especially when they start getting level up. He's got 20 health at level 3. And then you look at his level 2 innate ability, Heroic Destiny, which means the first time he goes down to 0 health each round, he immediately heals back up to 1, which essentially is like an action economy tax, which can be really helpful in keeping him alive, especially when you look at bringing him in a god like Ista, who has the Restoration Potion, to bring somebody back up to max health. The biggest kick in the pants when you get Brok down, you trigger Heroic Destiny, he heals 1, but you can't quite finish him off, and then one of his friends walks over, gives him the Restoration Potion, and heals all the way back up to 18 or even 20 health if he's level pretty rough. And so if you plan around it and limit what can get in on him, you can actually end up being pretty survivable. Jungling. This is an area he excels at. He has the common innate ability Monster Slayer, which means he gets +1 damage against monsters. So that 2, 3, 5 damage track becomes 3, 4, 6. Consider backswing, and suddenly he's swinging 6, 4, 10 total damage in one action. So he's a fantastic Monster Slayer. That's something that you'll honestly often do with Brok, is charge him into the monster turn 1, get him that kill, get him that Vorpal Blade so that he's got more reliable crits, and get him that level so that he's got his Heroic Destiny and is a bit more survivable from the get-go. Strong jungler, Brok's great. Utility, not a lot. He deals damage, what he does. God options, Bruelin. Why might you consider Brok if you're wanting to bring a bit more tankiness in your warband? If you start, doubling down, buying him defensive items, or keeping say Lugdrug, or making Lugdrug make him his ward, or things like that, he can definitely stick around. Like I said, he's great at killing monsters. So anytime you're at all worried about killing monsters, bring him in his god. Ista, he is the only high damage melee damage dealer in Ista, so he's kind of an auto include there. Outside of his chosen gods, he's pretty reliable, and beyond that first investment of fate in likely a Vorpal Blade, Potentially an armor shredder if you're up against a whole bunch of res, because his multiple attacks really benefit from being able to cut through armor. Um, he doesn't take a lot of fate. His cleave fate ability, where he makes a great X attack against every enemy within melee reach, honestly doesn't come up very often. Um, it does mean you get to ignore distracted, but you can't charge and then cleave. And so it just doesn't come up very often. You also can't trigger backswing off of it, so you're better off in many cases just single target damage, charge, hit, backswing. So it doesn't take a lot of fate, which is another reason you might consider taking him outside of his chosen gods if you want a sort of fate light melee damage dealer. His synergies, I think we called out hit fixers, Vorpal Blade, Heroes of Knockdown, Bastion's Heroic Ballad, that sort of thing. Um, Warnings, we talked about he's crit reliant, he wants that Vorpal Blade item, and he wants levels. His level 2 helps with survivability. His level 3, which we haven't talked about yet, is Molten Metal, and that is a clam cracker. Target adjacent enemy takes 1d6 true damage for each point of res it has, which means your Marcuses, your Lug Drugs will take 2d6 true damage for just one action and one fate, and then he can punch them twice. Or Donragar, heaven forbid, took stone form near Brok, takes 3d6 true damage. That's enough to burn through even Donragar's meaty health pool. So he definitely wants levels. It unlocks a whole nother damage profile that he can output. So keep that in mind when you're considering how you're building your warband. Moving on to our next high damage Bruiser is Drelgoth, the demon berserker of onslaught. You'll note his soul harvest is 1. He will not be harvesting souls today. His his move, agi, res, melee, all standard stuff. His damage track is only 2, 3, 4, which is kind of lame. He's one less crit than the other folks we've been talking about. However, we jump over to his dual wield common innate ability, which means every single attack action he takes with that X going to make a second one afterwards at -1 melee. So this actually increases we'll just jump straight into reliability. This increases his damage floor significantly. Because if Drelgoth attacks 3 times, and every single time just glances and deals 2, well, because he's got dual wield rather than just 3 attacks, he's actually attacking 6 times. So you've taken your damage floor essentially, assuming you only just glance, from 2 times 3, 6 to 2 times 6, 12, which is pretty solid. Obviously, this goes up the more you can roll more dice and the other sort of benefits you can stack on top of him. So anytime you can give him buffs, he makes a very good use of them because of his generally high attack volume. In terms of his burst, this is basically the same discussion we were just having, where if you can stack buffs on him, you look at his Empower level 2 ability that he can choose. Because he's a demon, he chooses what ability or one of his abilities to take when he levels up. He kind of default to Empower because it's more damage and that's his job. He gets a combat maneuver that for 2S, an enemy damaged by the axe attack takes 1 extra 2 damage. So if he gets 6 attacks and lands that Empower every single time, or up to 5 because of that Empower times 6, 30 damage. I mean, you're not likely to roll that, but he can certainly deal a lot of damage, and none of that cost any fate, which is pretty sweet. So don't underestimate the just raw damage Drelgoth can deal because of the volume of attacks he's putting out. His survivability, he actually does have a couple tricks to help his survivability. Base level 1, he's got his leap, which means he can place his move. That means he can disengage without taking parting blows, or jump over enemy defenders to get to the squishy nougat center of your opponent's warband, which is pretty sweet. Also, he can choose the Infernal ability when he levels up, which means he spends an action in the fate to get placed 4 hexes away, and then adjacent enemies get lit on fire, which is pretty sweet, especially if you've got other heroes that like fire, like say Astariel. Or you need to stop some enemy healing, like all those Minotaurs in Gruul, or even an Ista Restoration Potion, which can be pretty clutch. So he's got some sweet survivability options. He never needs to take a parting blow unless you just don't have the actions to do it. Juggling, he's actually fantastic, especially if you give him something like a Hunter's Knife artifact, which gives +2 damage versus monsters, and once per game, you can opt to use it to give him just +1 damage against anything. Again, back to the whole high attack volume thing, he takes those buffs really well. Can absolutely crush monsters when he's rocking that Hunter's Knife. That's actually the default offensive item that I like to equip him with because his attack volume just makes it worth it almost every time. Utility, we did call out his Infernal ability to bring in Burn. He does also have his Cripple ability, where he can inflict -1 move and increase the cost of combat maneuvers on the enemy struck by Cripple. Not something you take often. His sort of default leveling abilities are Empower and Infernal, but it's an option. If it comes up, you can consider it. He's got options. Brelin, I don't know. I like him in Brelin. I like the high damage floor that he brings, especially if you're taking a more swingy damage dealer like Zhonyja that really wants to rely on crits. It's helpful to have another hero that has a very reliable damage profile that you sure will go off. In Gruul, he's one of 2 primary melee damage dealers, himself and Thorgar, so you'll often just take him in Gruul because he's a champion and Gruul's FG power really benefits. So he's good there. Outside of his 2 chosen gods, again, you're looking at that fire synergy, or anytime you're bringing a warband that's heavily centered around buffs, like keep saying it, I think Bastion's heroic ballad, people with knockdown, etc. His synergies we've called out, his hit fixers and his Hunter's Knife. I don't really have any cautions for him. He's got he does what he does, and he does it pretty well. I guess I haven't mentioned his Blood Challenge 1 Fate ability. This is a pretty cool one where he gets to ignore being distracted when he's attacking somebody, and the target cannot have their res increased, like say Marcus's Protective Stance, have damage redirected, like say Sky's Diversion, or benefit from temporary health, like Skull's Bulwark, from friendly abilities. Existing friendly defender effects on the target of axe attack do not have any effect. That again gets back to like Protective Stance. And this expires at the end of Drelgoth's current activation. So that's the you there, I'm gonna kill you and no one's gonna stop me ability, which is pretty nice to have in your back pocket. So all in all, Drelgoth's great. Definitely consider bringing him, especially in his chosen gods, but even worth looking at outside of that for a reliable melee damage dealer. The last of our high damage Bruisers, speaking of reliable melee damage dealers, is Thorgar. Thorgar's a Minotaur. He does have just 1 Soul Harvest, so he's got better things to do than try and hoover up souls. Movement 3, standard Minotaur Agi of 3, Res 0, Mel 7. His damage track on his Great Axe, however, is 1 up from normal, being a 3, 4, 6. And of course, as a Minotaur, he has Regeneration 2 and a massive health pool starting with 17 at level 1 and going all the way up to 21 at level 3. Talking about burst damage, he's sort of in the same realm as Drelgoth, where his burst damage is just a base high damage track. He doesn't have any abilities like the assassins with Death Toll or Toxin that increases damage. But he does have the ability to roll a lot of dice and make multiple attacks. So you look over at his Mancatcher level 2 ability, which is sort of a utility, but also tends to increase your damage, because for 1 action, you target an enemy within 3 hexes, who are then pushed towards Thorgar, and, assuming they're within range, immediately after resolving it, he can make a Great Axe attack against the enemy for 0 actions. This means that more often than not, Thorgar's going to get 3 attacks every round. And then, if we want to talk more about reliability, you look over at his Enraged Assault active ability, where he gains +2 Mel to bring him up to Mel 9, at the cost of -2 Agi to make him Agi 1. Remove Pin and gain immunity to Pin. This means that you're always going to be rolling a ton of dice against whatever it is you want to hit, if you really want to, via Enraged Assault, and landing those 6 damage crits. So he is, in my mind, without a doubt, the most reliable melee damage dealer in the game, as long as you're willing to trade off the fact that he's Agi 1 is going to take a lot of damage in return unless you position him away from retaliation. So speaking of survivability, in that case, we've mentioned his giant health pool, we've mentioned his regeneration, we have mentioned that you can bring him down to Agi 1, which is pretty bad, but we haven't mentioned his level 3 Unstoppable Rage, where if he is reduced to 0 health while Enraged Assault is affecting him, he doesn't die. Just straight up, does not die. However, he will die if his health is 0 at the end of any friendly hero's activation or at the end of the round, whichever comes first. Essentially, this means you get one chance the very next activation of one of your friendly heroes to heal Thorgar before he dies. Otherwise, he will die. This can be particularly helpful if you're bringing, a healer, like, say, Bastion or Nias or Saiyan or Isabel. Or you're playing an Ista and you have that restoration potion to walk over and pop him back to full health. So he can actually be incredibly survivable just via having a ton of health and requiring that one extra, activation to make sure he stays dead. But you can also misplay him and Enraged Assault when you're in range of a bunch of things that you shouldn't be in range of, and then he gets dogpiled on and dies. So be mindful, but generally speaking, you can get away with a lot with Thorgar. Jungling, he's great at, especially like turn 1. One of the biggest problems turn 1 is your dice just abandon you. You're just like, oh, I'll charge this Gloom and kill it with Brok, no problem. Oh, I rolled a glance and a glance. Crap. Bummer. Thorgar fixes that problem because he can Enraged Assault from L9, charge in turn 1, and be out of range of any sort of retaliation, and get you the monster kill, no problem. So super great there for jungling. He's got a high base damage stat line. So even if you're just like, say, solid on a monster, that's still 12 damage. You're still dead. So very reliable jungler there. His utility, he actually does bring a bit of utility in his hurl combat maneuver, which is a symbol letter J and lets you throw an adjacent enemy that's been damaged by the Great Axe attack that throws them 2 hexes away and knocks them down. Now the trick here is this combos with his level 2 Mancatcher. You could attack something, hurl them 2 hexes away, then use your Mancatcher ability to pull them in and hit them again, and this time they're knocked down. So you're likely gonna crit all the time. Obviously, knocking down enemies benefits all the other heroes that like shooting things with low agility. So that's some good utility there. His god options, I don't know, man. Always consider Thorgar, in my opinion. He's super strong consideration in Borellan and Grohl. He takes no fate. You'll notice none of his abilities on his card cost fate. The only time he'll spend fate is you might buy him an item. He's a great candidate, actually, for the Borellan Sacred Artifact second win, since he does like backing out of range as his defensive ability. He doesn't typically need like a Vorpal Blade because you've got Enraged Assault, but you might spend it on an Armor Shredder if you're facing a lot of res. But otherwise, doesn't take a lot of fate and so can fit into just about any warband you like. He's definitely worth, in fact, I would say he's almost an auto include in a Gruul warband because the Gruul Sacred Artifact Staff of Gruul makes him Hex 2 reach, which is particularly relevant with Mancatcher, where you'll note, of course, if you have to pull an enemy, they have to move in a straight line. That's how pushes work in this case. And it's possible that there's something in the way. You can't push the enemy adjacent to Thorgar. Well, if he's got the Staff of Gruul, that doesn't matter. You pull the enemy within 2 hexes, and he gets to hit them anyway, which is pretty great. So, Thorgar, fantastic in Gruul. Fantastic anywhere. Always consider. Synergies, I think we already called out the healers to make sure that he lives through his Unstoppable Rage. We already called out Staff of Gruul. Ring of Invisibility is a 0-cost defensive item that I'll call out as sort of his default buy, in my opinion, If he has the opportunity to purchase weapons or pick up a bounty, um, consider getting him the Ring of Invisibility because he lives and dies by how many attacks can come into him. If he enraged assaults but no one can attack him, no problem. Whereas if there's an enemy range damage dealer staring across from him, he kind of doesn't want to use enraged assault because then they can blow him up in return. If he can be invisible though, that doesn't matter. So Ring of Invisibility is a strong consideration for him. The cautions I will call out, he does want levels, especially his level 2. Mancatcher opens up so many options. Being able to move things around the board in Judgment is incredibly powerful, incredibly potent. Imagine, say, there's a monster, an enemy that's near the monster. You can actually Mancatcher the enemy into adjacency with a monster who then punches them and then Thorgar gets to attack the enemy, that's just like free, probably 6 to 8 damage, depending on what the monster is. That can be huge. So, Mancatcher is really important. I consider that a really high priority for leveling up. So, definitely consider that when you're building your warband. That's Thorgar, though, I'd say in a nutshell. Moving on to the first of our 3 utility bruisers, we have Barnascus, a dwarf in a tank with flamethrowers. Who could be sad about that? Looking at his stats, you can see he's got that Soul Harvest 4, which means you might actually do some soul harvesting with him. He's not undead, hopefully you can tell, so he can collect those souls for himself and for your benefit. So that is an option. He's movement 3, however, like Fazeal, he is mounted, so he'll get that extra. Well, he won't get movement; he will get extra melee on the charge. He is Dwarf Agi 3. He is Res 1, because after all, he is in a tank. Male 6, so it's not as high as the other ones we've talked about. However, now, thanks to that mounted on a charge, he's back up to that Male 7 effectively. So he gets that benefit. And then he does have RNG 7, which he uses for his flamethrower. So he does actually like the opportunity to sit and shoot a little bit, especially if he can aim up to a range 8. You can see the damage track for his tank hull melee attack and flamethrower ranged attack are the same. So whichever is going to give you the best result for any given scenario you find yourself in, you may find that, you know what, I want to charge in because you look over at his trample combat maneuver. Enemy damaged by the tank hull attack suffers knockdown, which we all know is sweet at this point. But if you roll a J as part of that combat maneuver, so in this case like a J and an S to get that trample, and the enemy is damaged, they take an extra 1 true damage, which is pretty sweet. And the exact same sort of rules text applies to his ranged attack with Hot Fire. 2S, enemy damaged by flamethrower suffers burn rather than knockdown, and if you roll a J, they take 1 extra true damage. So he's got some great combat maneuvers that unfortunately both cost 2S, so they're not too common to pull off. But that's when you're looking at his charges to land that knockdown because of his mounted bonus, or you're aiming to try and bring up the odds to hit hot fire. You can also look over at his enfilade. I have no idea if that's how you actually pronounce it, but that's what I'm going with. His enfilade unique innate ability, where you can target 2 enemies adjacent to each other with flamethrower, and you roll dice separately on those 2 different enemies with a -1 penalty after everything else gets modified to a minimum of 1 die. This can be particularly good if you bought him, say, a Heartseeker, brought up his RNG to 8 base, aims up to 9, or if you're shooting at generally low agility, or knockdown heroes, or you have any other buffs, he can suddenly put out a shocking amount of damage, which is particularly nasty if you end up landing your hot fire and light them on fire so that they can't recover from it. They can't heal. So that's where his burst can come from. Dice often say no because he's got a lot of, that enfilade gives that -1 die penalty. And it can be hard, oftentimes where he's positioned, you'll be shooting into melee, so you won't be getting that many dice to begin with. But man, if the opportunity comes up or your dice just say yes, whew, it could be a lot. Oops. So moving on to his survivability, he is Dwarf Tree 1, which is pretty good. And his health starts at 16, goes up to 20. He hits level 3. Generally solid, not super tanky. And if you want him to survive a lot, you'll probably want to invest a little bit more. whether that's like Marcus's protective stance or buying him the boots of agility to bring him up to Agi 3, or even a glyph of warding, which can make him 3/2 and very tanky. No pun intended. Um, Generally speaking, he is more survivable than your bog standard damage dealer, but you need to invest just a bit more to make him, I would say, tanky. Um, Jungling, he's okay. He can, like, I think he actually takes the Hunter's Knife fairly well. Because the Hunter's Knife with, say, Enfilade and that once per game ability lets you get a little bit, just a little bit more juice out of that since he's making multiple attacks there. And he's not unhappy to go around chasing monsters. If he gets to knock down the monster, even if he doesn't get a push, he can stay engaged with them and they won't punish him for staying there and hit him back. And he, of course, can set up the monster kill for his friends. So, not a bad jungler, I would say. Um, his utility, like we've talked about, he's good. He's a great setup hero. He's got that knockdown. He can inflict fire for, say, Astariel, for example. And uh, that's kind of where his utility is coming from. He does also have Pathfinder in case you've got a bunch of terrain that you need to deal with. He's happy just rolling on that with his tank treads. Um, and I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't call out on survivability. His repair ability, he can just spend an action to repair himself for 3 health +1 for each level he's gained, which is a nice little perk that if you're fate strapped, he can heal himself. He's also steady at level 2, which means the first time he gets knocked down, he doesn't actually get knocked down. And then at level 3, he gets +1 res versus magic attacks. And if an enemy enters within 2 hexes, they take 2 true damage. And or if an enemy ends their activation within 2 hexes, they take 2 true damage. Now, this can only be incurred once per hero activation, so it's not like an enemy charges Barnascus, takes 2, and then ends their activation, takes another 2. It's only going to happen that one time, the first time they charge in. But it's also something you can make happen by, say, having a friendly hero push an enemy hero into Barnascus, where they take an additional true damage. You can sort of use them to, or use him to increase the damage output of your friends, which is a neat little utility trick. Looking at his god options, Bruellen, the main thing he's packing there is the unique ability of a ranged attack. He's got a gun, which can be especially fun on the Bruellen effigy turn, which says the opponent's effigy, cannot be targeted by melee attacks during your Bruellen effigy turn. It doesn't say anything about ranged attacks, so you can benefit from the charge action reduction from the Bruellen effigy power to charge in with Barnascus, get range onto the opponent's effigy, shove off of whatever you just charged, and then pop 2 flamethrower shots into the opponent's effigy for a surprise assassination. So it's got that sort of threat extension angle to the Bruellen effigy power that other heroes without a ranged attack might not get to benefit from. His other god is Ista, which again, if you're investing in tankiness, he can sort of lean into that strength and become yet another durable hero. You're bringing in your warband. Stariel's also in Ista, so he's another fire setup hero for her. So decent consideration there. Outside of his 2 gods, I don't think you'll see him too much. Again, consider what the rest of your warband wants and needs, and maybe you'll find a spot for him. But generally speaking, I think he mostly shows up in Bruellen and Ista. No real cautions for him. Just understand that unless you're really investing in him, he's not as durable as you might think a tank is, so don't get him killed. Next up, we've got Kain, the Demon Priest of Onslaught. Kain's fun. He's one of those HP wizards, I'll say, where he can trade HP for, in this case, damage, but other effects in general. Just checking out his stats, he's got that Soul Harvest of 4, so he may end up Soul Harvesting for you. He has Movement 3, Standard, Agi 4, Res 0, Mail 7, and Mage 7. So he's got a decently good offensive profile, both in melee and for magic. 2, 3, 4 across both his Ritual Sword and his Blood Magic attack. Common Demon innate ability of Coalesce. However, he does get Blood Scent, which is +1 move and +1 melee, when charging an enemy below half of its current maximum health. So a little bit of, smell the blood, I'm going to go kill them in melee. But the money ability, and this is where we get into his burst, is Blood Pact. So Blood Pact means you interrupt a ritual sword attack after the damage is resolved. So you roll your attack, you choose your damage, you go, all right, I'm going to Blood Pact now. But before combat maneuvers are applied, if you choose enemy that you just hit and a friendly hero within 2 hexes, which doesn't have to be Kain, it certainly can be Kain, but it doesn't have to be. Maybe it's a Minotaur, a whole pile of health over there. A friendly hero within 2 hexes take up to the same amount of true damage taken by the enemy from the original attack. So let's say you charged in, you crit with your sword for 4, and then you Blood Pact, you deal another 4 to your friend or yourself, and another 4 to your enemy for a total of 8 damage suddenly. Blood Pact cannot be used on the opponent's effigy or a friendly hero if the damage would kill them, so you can't kill off your friend in exchange for killing an enemy. But you certainly can kill the enemy, and it can only happen once per activation. So this can be a nice burst of damage that he brings as long as you've got the health to pay for it. His reliability is mostly just around the fact that he's both Mel 7 and Mage 7. So whether he's in melee or whether he wants to hang out at range, he's always going to be dealing that 2, 3, 4 damage. He's got Cleave in case he ends up engaged with a whole bunch of things and he wants to back out. He also gains at level 2, one of his options for leveling up as a demon is Unerring Accuracy, which means he can reroll a basic attack once per activation, which again helps his reliability. Starting to talk about his survivability, he has as a level up ability the Temporal Shift Fate ability that he can choose, where at the end of his activation, place him in the hex where he started. Obviously, if the hex is occupied, he can't go back to it, but that lets him sort of yo-yo, charge in or walk up, shoot, or walk up, harvest a soul, and then bloop, get teleported back, which is nice if you've got spare fate. His jungling capability is okay. Blood Pact can be good if the monster doesn't have res. If they do have res, like say a Canuck or worst case a Terra, he's not going to be doing enough damage to double and really benefit from Blood Pact. So he's okay at monster hunting, especially if you give him a hunter's knife, then absolutely he can pop any monster that he wants to, but keep that in mind. General utility, so he's got Mortal Wounds at level 1 for his combat maneuver. 2S, enemy damaged by either his sword or his blood magic attack cannot heal by any means until the end of its next activation, after which Mortal Wounds expires. This is a unique anti-healing ability where, unlike the burn condition, where an opponent can cleanse that, or there's actually a fair number, well, not a fair number, Bastion, for example, or Cradle can remove it. There's really not a lot you can do about Mortal Wounds. Think right now, literally the only hero in the game that can remove Mortal Wounds, outside of just activating and having it fall off at the end of your activation, is Cradle at level 2. Which means if you really need something to not be able to heal, Kain's your man. So he's bringing that utility, which is pretty sweet. He's also bringing the Soothe ability that he can choose when he levels up, which gives him another combat maneuver for 2S, where a target friendly model within 2 hexes of him, which again can include himself, can heal for the amount of damage that the enemy just suffered from his blood magic attack, which is pretty sweet if you can say crit and roll 2S and heal somebody for 4. It's not something that comes up a lot, but it's certainly a playstyle you can pivot into. Maybe buy him a Ring of Power, for example, to bump his match up to 8. He'll start doing more damage. Soothes. It's an option to consider and something unique amongst our Bruiser category here. Looking at his God options, interestingly enough, he doesn't stand out especially in his gods. In Krognar, he doesn't use Shadow Orbs. He doesn't inflict poison. He does play a little bit with health, and there's a little bit of healing in Krognar, like say via Cradle, and Zarin with his Vampiric Touch each ability, or say Skull with his Bulwark, where King can use the temporary hit points from Bulwark to power his Blood Pack, which is pretty sweet. So worth considering in Krugnar if you start thinking a little bit laterally. And then in Tomas, the obvious synergy, of course, is making Mortal Wounds 1S instead of 2S, which is certainly not a bad thing. He's not likely to take the Diamond Armor. You can give it to him, but he doesn't care that much about it. But he does certainly like the Tomas Warband bonus, which means you heal when you kill an enemy hero. And if he's been cutting people with Blood Pact, that's always a good thing. So worth considering within his gods. Outside of his gods, the main reason you're going to take him is because he's a demon and you're playing the demon horde and want to make use of janky coalesce abilities or demonic gateway abilities, or you really want an anti-healing tool that is even more reliable than fire or burn. So that's when you would consider taking Kain outside of his gods. We already called out the Skull synergy, where Skull's Bulwark temporary hit points can be used to power his Blood Pact, which is pretty sweet. Obviously, he loves healers. And consider buying him the Bloodsucker defensive item, which gives him Leech 2, which means he'll almost always have, the ability to charge his Blood Pact thanks to himself. Since he'll attack, he'll do his damage, he'll Blood Pack and leech the health back. So, pretty sweet. The main caution is that since he does like to spend health, probably want to get some healers with him in some form or another. Finally, we get to Piper. Looking at his stats, Piper is maybe, I don't know, maybe a bit average might be the way to describe him. So he's got the Soul Harvest of 4, which is good. It means he'll Soul Harvest decently well with some help. Movement of 3, it's okay. Agi 5, standard Agi 5 for an elf, which is good. But his health of 13 at level 1 kind of sucks. He's a little bit fragile, you might think. He only gains 1 health on level, so he's not exactly getting beefy when he's leveled. No res. Mel 6, not great. Magic 6, also not great. His dagger 2, 3, 4, nothing special to write home about. And his mage hand of 1, 2, 3 is definitely weak, right? So you might think just based on that, ooh, the stat bad. Not so. Look over at his Enhanced Self active ability, which for 1 fate, he gets to add +1 to his move, Mel, Mage, Agi, and Soul Harvest for his activation. Expires at the start of his next activation. So suddenly, he's Soul Harvest 5, Move 4, Agi 6, Mel 7, Mage 7. Okay, he's gotten a lot more reliable in doing whatever it is you need him to do with the expenditure of that fate. Additionally, he's an elf, he's got dash. So that move stat, which is either 3 or 4 if you enhance yourself, he gets another hex of movement. This makes him incredibly fast, especially when you consider his Mystic Step innate ability, which allows him to be placed in an adjacent hex at the start of his activation. So let's add all that up. Just pause for a second. And baseline move 3. Place 1 hex, go 4 hexes. Dashes for 5 hexes. Enhance self, 6 hexes. And if he charges, 7 hexes. That is the longest threat range of any hero in the game, period, in Melee. Really remarkable. So his stats are a little deceiving when you first look at them. Talking about his damage, we again get into Deception, where we've got Backstab as the common innate ability. This is relevant for his Dagger melee attack, where if he's attacking somebody that another friendly model is engaging, he gets +1 damage. So that 2, 3, 4 dagger becomes a 3, 4, 5 damage dagger, which is pretty sweet. That's about it for his burst damage, though. That's as good as it gets. His reliability, not bad. Like, if he glances for 3 because you're backstabbing, pretty good, even if he's not rolling that many dice. His survivability can be phenomenal. So again, we talked about Enhanced Self, bringing him up to Agi 6 potentially. He also has the Duplicate Self active ability, which basically means he spends an action, puts Duplicate Self up, and the next time an enemy attacks him that actually hits, he just ignores it. Nothing happens. Duplicate Self goes away, that attack goes away, it's done. The enemy can still push themselves, but they can't do anything to Piper. And so Additionally, if you pair him at all with any sort of defensive buff, like say Skull's Bulwark or Marcus's Protective Stance, typically what's going to happen with Piper is someone's going to charge him, burn Duplicate Self, and then they're going to swing a normal attack against his Agi of 6, which means they're going to get 1, 2 dice, maybe 3 in the best of situations, and he takes, I don't know, a glance or a solid, or maybe they roll nothing, and he doesn't worry about it. He can be incredibly survivable as long as you're limiting the volume of attacks that can get to him, because you're trying to maximize the use out of that or the impact of that Duplicate Self. So definitely can be very survivable. You'll also note his level 2 Viper Venom gives him a 2F combat maneuver that can activate Duplicate Self without spending any actions. So that again helps his survivability while maintaining your damage output, which is pretty sweet. Jungling, he's not great. He's got an interesting angle to jungling. So obviously, if you just want to kill something, you want to maximize his damage capability. He needs a backstab buddy. That means one of your heroes needs to stay engaged with the monster, which most of the time means the monster is going to punch whatever hero is standing there. And that's a bad thing for you. If you've got a 2-hex reach hero, like say Gendris or a Gruul champion with the Staff of Gruul, you can get the backstab bonus without getting punched by a monster, which is great. But otherwise, so-so on melee jungling capabilities. However, he does have the unique ability of Ghost Touch. When he resolves one of his mage hand attacks, he can execute push combat maneuvers as if the attack was a melee attack. That means he can push enemies with that reach for mage hand. And it doesn't actually do a lot of damage. So his way of jungling is shove the monster into your opponent and make the monster their problem. Doesn't deal a lot of damage, so he's not softening them up a whole bunch, and then just bloop, that monster is your problem. I'm not going to deal with it. So that can be a particularly nasty angle to look for, especially considering monsters often have really high attack stats, like L8 or RNG 9 on Terra, and can be really nasty when they land. So interesting spin on the jungler here. Utility, we've already talked about a whole bunch. So, Ghost Touch, being able to push things from range is incredibly powerful. Lots of utility there. He's bringing a potentially Soul Harvest 5 stat to the table with Enhanced Self, so he can absolutely be a Soul Gazer for you, especially when you consider Mystic Step, where he can be 2 away from Soul, step close to be, or step 1x to be now adjacent to it without having to spend any actions, get the harvest, back up, etc. Lots of flexibility there. And then finally, his level 3 Taunt ability, where a target enemy within 3 hexes becomes taunted. If he's alive and in line of sight at the start of the taunted model's next activation, he is the only enemy model that the taunted model can target during its next activation. So if, again, like we said, you invested in his defensive capabilities, he put up Duplicate Self, maybe he's got Bulwark on him, he's got Enhanced Self up, and you taunt an enemy, they're going to have a really impotent activation next round. Or, you need to protect your, say, Zyvera, who's got 2 souls bound to her. Okay, he taunts your enemy's main damage dealer, and that's off the table. So great utility there, great flexibility. Piper really embodies the jack of all trades, master of none. But even then, when you focus on what you want him to do, he can really perform. I've never been unhappy to put Piper on the table. So definitely worth a shot. Specific synergies, of course, like we mentioned, is backstab buddies. Make sure he's got some dudes who want to hang out in melee so you can stab them. Avoid, say, heroes who don't have melee attack stats like Saiyan, Stariel, or Maltique, so that they can't help him out with that backstab. And the caution, like we called out, he dies to volume of attacks. With that Duplicate Self losing value, the more attacks come your way. And he really doesn't have that much raw HP, so he will go down even if it's to a fury of 1,000 cuts. Watch out for that. Whew, my goodness. That brings us to the end of our Assassins and Bruisers breakdown. You can see the summary here. I will say you probably always want to end up with at least one of the top 6 heroes. Either those top 3 assassins or those 3 high damage bruisers. You always want to end up with them hitting the table after bans, unless you're playing a really particular game plan. because if you can't kill enemy heroes, you can't collect their souls, which means you can't win the game. Uh, you might be playing some really janky, like I'm just gonna play the soul domination game, sit on a soul pit, strip souls off my foe, and never need to worry about killing anything because I'm just vacuuming up these souls. Okay, that's a thing you can do. I've seen that played to success, but it's a very distinctive and dedicated playstyle. Most of the time, you need things that can kill things. So probably make sure you can get at least one of these top 6 heroes on the table after bans. And I've even seen warbands that take 3 or 4 of them and do reasonably well. The main consideration when you're doing that is not losing the souls that they gain to counter kills, because then you're net -1, which is a bummer. So that's it for the Assassins and Bruisers coverage. I think next up we're going to do Shooters and Snipers to round out our big damage dealers. I'll put a link to the Judgement Discord in the description if you want to jump in there, start talking dojo, have questions, or even play an online game with folks. Lots of friendly folks there. Yeah, hope that was helpful, and we'll see you in the between.